Welcome to Leaders in Lending. I'm your host, Jeff Keltner. This week's episode features my conversation with Britt Faircloth, the SVP and Fair Banking Officer at Valley Bank. Britt and I had a really fun conversation. We went through her approach on compliance to partnering with product, deeper in the product development cycle, about looking for the right kinds of products for your community, not just the right compliance checks on your products. We also talked through a little bit about diversity and inclusion and the importance of your staff mirroring your customer base in terms of having the right voices at the table and perspectives being brought together. And at the end, she used this great phrase, the fair lending thought process applied to non-lending products. And I thought the exploration of what that meant and how that applied was really interesting. So lots of great thoughts. I'm loving bringing in compliance leaders, leaders outside of the pure lending space to give us their perspectives. I think it's a really unique point of view. And this conversation with Britt has a lot of great perspectives for anybody in the space. So please enjoy this conversation with Britt Faircloth. Britt, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for making the time to join us today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I've started using the same question for all my guests to start off the podcast because I think it's really fascinating. I just gotta say, most of us didn't grow up dreaming of being bankers, so I'd love to understand, what the path was that led you to being, a fair banking officer at a bank. It's a pretty different thing than you probably dreamed about when you were a kid.
Yeah, no, and probably very different than a lot of compliance paths. I actually started in banking as a drive-up teller, like 2 weeks after I graduated high school or something in '98. So yeah, and that was largely because I just wanted something with good hours. Like that was really my primary concern, I think, at the time. Right? It was like you don't have to work a lot of weekends, you don't have to work at night. And I really found that I enjoyed it. So I was a drive up teller at a very small credit union. I worked as an in lobby teller at a larger institution, and then I switched to back office in operational roles like deposit ops, loan ops, and then about 11 or 12 years ago, an opportunity came up in compliance, and I just was looking for a change, and it happened to be a fair lending focused role. And they were willing to train me. And once I got into it, I loved the data analytics piece of it. I loved the fact that you got to feel like you were doing something really good for communities and being able to help make sure that products were transparent and fair. I loved that aspect. And so I've been focused on that pretty much ever since.
Interesting. That is interesting, Pat. I haven't had anybody say I started off as a drive-up teller. We have to, the millennials out there have to do a little Google search on what drive.
Yeah, the tubes and everything,
Oh
right?
yeah, the old tubes and the
interesting.
They still have a few of those here in my town. They're they got an ATM in there, but you can still see the chute for the tubes, and they get the 2 lanes for the drive up and the whole thing. So it was a thing. Well, tell me a little bit about your role as a fair banking officer. How do you think about what the your primary objectives are? It's kind of a broad category, I feel like, and I'm always curious how you think about kind of what your main objective are, what you're trying to get done at the bank.
It's very broad. So I cover every product and service at the bank, essentially in some way, from sort of the conception and design process through the marketing, through disclosures, delivery, complaints, anything and everything I may have a role in. And so I like to think about it as helping to make sure that the products that we put out meet the needs of the community, that they're fair, and that they're relatively, transparent, that people can understand what their expectations should be of what they're getting in a product or service from Valley Bank, and that we deliver on what we tell them that they're going to get.
How do you, so I loved your answer that you like the data analytics portion of the experience. How do you think about the data that informs, like meet the needs of the community, fair? Those are really interesting questions because they're not necessarily easy to define or quantify exactly what meets the bar. How do you think about, defining or using data to kind of drive the question of like, what are the products that meet the needs of the community and are we offering them in a fair way?
Yeah, it's interesting because in some ways we have more data now than we probably ever have in the past, but it's not always easy to sort of condense it down and figure out what you need,
Totally.
So I'm often looking at things like denial rates across different groups and are we denying certain groups of borrowers and applicants more frequently? And if so, is there a reason for that? Is there truly a credit quality
Hmm.
difference? And if so, what's driving that? So are we denying more people because maybe they don't have the right amount of cash to close, for example? And if they do, and there's that sort of liquidity issue, do we have an opportunity to maybe partner with some groups or to set up something where we can help people with down payment assistance?
Hmm.
And is there a way that we can help to change that? Or if we think that there's an issue from a financial literacy standpoint, is there a way for us to partner and provide education to start getting borrowers ready for some of our products? So, really, we're trying very hard to look at data differently now, even though it's data that maybe we've already had access to for a long time. But how do we get to the right point to where it's
Yeah.
meaningful? Because there's so much data available that if you're not thinking about what it really means and how you can leverage it, it's very easy to get overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's such a great point because I think there's this. Sometimes people talk about data being the new whatever. It's like super valuable. I actually feel like it's almost the opposite. Not that data is not valuable, but data can be overwhelming, and it's the ability to draw insights from data. And by the way, everybody has lots of data. People are like, well, I got so much data, it's valuable. Everybody's got lots of data. We're generating tons of data these days, but the ability to like draw insights from the data and then make smart choices based on it is much harder than getting access to large amounts of data. And it's a hard thing to do well, I think.
Yeah, it's a whole different skill set. It really, really is.
Yeah. And I love the comment you're making because it really connects the idea of compliance. I mean, I think compliance can feel like this like checkbox, almost the way legal sometimes feels to me in organizations where it's kind of like opposed to the business and it's like the hurdle that I must cross to get done the thing that I want to do. And you're really talking about compliance partnering with product areas to
Mhm.
say, how do we actually improve the experience of customers in a positive way, not be the stumbling block on the good idea, which I feel is how certainly fintechs tend to view the function of compliance, and I think sometimes how some of the bankers and line of business folks tend to view it. And I love the idea that you're a partner in development of product and not a checkbox along the path of it.
Yeah, and that's not just a fintech viewpoint. I think I started in compliance where the viewpoint was that compliance was like the land of no, right? That you would come with this
Yeah,
great idea and compliance would be like, nope. And we've really, I think, as an industry, tried to shift from that. I think in the last several years to where it's not a no, it's a maybe. Um, maybe we can do this, and here are ways that we can mitigate the
yeah,
risk
yeah.
to do something, and here's what I can bring to the table to help you do it. Maybe I can provide you with information. Maybe I can provide you with metrics. Whatever the case may be, but how can our team be a resource to a business line to help them achieve what they're trying to do?
Yeah. How do you drive that change in culture, not just in your team, but I'm curious how you drive the change in perception and engagement style across line of business owners that maybe have grown up in the traditional world of banking where they're kind of view compliance, I think of legal in some ways, in opposition. So kind of like, I'm going to wait off until the last minute to talk to these folks and see if I can get my rubber stamp. How do you think about changing the mindset and engaging those folks earlier so you can actually have a more collaborative approach to finding better solutions to your client needs?
Yeah, I think it just takes time in some cases, right? You have to be their partner and back them a few times when you can
Mm,
before they start to realize like, oh, this is a resource. And so you have to offer to help a lot. I find before people will start taking you up on it. But once they take you up on it and they realize that you can bring value, it's usually very smooth sailing. But it takes time to get
you
there.
gotta you gotta prove it, right? Like you have to
Yeah,
prove.
you got to prove it. Sometimes, you got to bribe them. Maybe you've got to be the person that shows up to the meeting with cookies. I don't know, but you have to
One of
you
my
have to
favorite
really make
product
sure
managers
that.
from Google wrote a book called "Always Bring the Donuts," and that was his like,
See,
always be
it's
the guy who brings the
true.
donuts to the meeting.
Yeah. Because then you're friendly and you're approachable because you provided afternoon snacks or morning
Or,
breakfast or whatever it is. But a lot of compliance I find is relationship building, and if you can build relationships with people, they're comfortable coming to you. And my job is predicated a lot on people being comfortable with talking
mm,
to me about what they think the needs are, about what the challenges are. I will never know everything about every product and service and every line of business if people don't come to me.
yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to ask: are there particular product areas you've been focused on, or things you guys think you've done that are interesting and innovative? We talked about a couple the last time you and I spoke, but I'd be curious where you think there are interesting product areas you're engaging in that might be lessons to learn for others in the industry.
I don't know if it's a specific product area, but I will say that one of the things that we have focused on very heavily is our own internal diversity.
Mm,
We've really taken the approach and the thought process that in order for us to really serve our communities, our internal staff should try to mirror those communities a little bit better. That there will always be certain groups of people that feel more comfortable dealing with someone who looks like them, sounds like them, or is like them in some way. So we've really focused a lot. We've got a great DEI officer and her team that have worked sort of tirelessly. We feel very strongly that where we have more diversity, we have more diversity of thought.
mhm,
That brings greater ideas of how to serve our communities, and that we all, grow and better ourselves in that way. So we have several associate resource groups that our
mhm,
DE&I team sort of facilitated and set up. And so, whether you're an Asian employee, Hispanic, African American, LGBTQ. We have several of these groups, and the premise is that anybody can join these groups and sit in on their webinars, their events, and it's a great way for people to sort of learn about their coworkers
mhm.
and what's important to them. And I think that helps to drive the conversation about what's important to our communities. And if you understand that, I think you're on your way to serving them better.
That's great. Tell me a little more about these associate resource groups. Like, how do you think about the structure, the purpose, how they operate? It's a fascinating idea, but it's one I actually serve as an executive advisor to one of our internal employee resource groups, is what we call
Mhm.
them, but kind of how they function. And one of the things I think is interesting is this question of, are they there to serve the needs of that employee base? Are they there to help educate the employees about the experiences and perspective and
Mhm.
history of that category of people, and how you balance, because sometimes I feel like those groups are being asked to serve the company by like running a Black History Month series of events, or Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, his series of events that are kind of like work for the company. And then there's sometimes when I want the company to be doing work to support them and their experiences and their. So talk to me about how you think about the balance between those two in the context of those associate resource groups.
I think it is a balance, and I think ideally it's a little bit of both,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So, you may have a women's resource group that helps to pair maybe junior workers with senior female mentors that can help them navigate challenges that might be unique to being a woman in the industry.
Hmm.
And I think that serves that group of employees very well. But we do also have times where our associate resource groups are doing things like you're talking about Black History Month,
Hmm.
or there were some Asian and Pacific Islander heritage events. We have some great Hispanic events, and those I think serve as a purpose to really sort of educate the whole employee base, and to help them
Yeah.
to sort of drive better understanding of different people in the organization, and help to maybe have people working together with a more diverse group of people. So I think it has to be both, and I think you're very successful when it is both,
Yeah.
in helping to sort of drive really good collaboration and inclusion, right? Because you can be diverse and still not be inclusive.
It's very true.
I mean, that's the reality. We don't like to say that, but it's true. You can be very diverse, but
Mm.
still not have people that feel like they belong or that they're included. So I think when you have both of those sides to it, you help to drive the actual inclusion piece.
Yeah, that's great. That's a fabulous point. Um, Tell me, I know you guys are doing some work on the corporate social responsibility side. It's certainly one of the hot topics these
Yeah.
days. Tell me a little bit about what you guys have going on in that space, what you've been working on.
We have a very, very robust corporate social responsibility and environmental, social, and governance team. There's a committee that meets to talk about very broad, high topics like climate change and things of that nature. We put out our ESG report recently that talks about all of our efforts in the corporate social
Hmm.
responsibility and ESG space, and that was really great to sort of start to compile everything, because some of these things are housed kind of across the organization in work that we're doing, whether it's volunteerism. Our CRA team, of course, has a very active role in working with community groups and
Sure.
providing services and providing funding for things. So, really, we have tried to tie it all together in that ESG report. And like I said, we have a very broad team that is doing a lot of work across many different groups and avenues. It's actually, there were some things when I read the report that I was like, man, I didn't know we were doing that either. So it's very broad, and I'm very proud of what we've managed to do. I don't think a week goes by that I don't see some sort of corporate communication about how we were active in something, whether it was a food bank or
Mm.
some kind of 5K walk for a cause, or raising money for something. So we have an employee base that is very, very active in their communities. I will say that.
Are you doing anything on the financial education side? I feel like this is this really interesting topic for banks. And
Mhm.
and it's, we've struggled with this, frankly, at Upstart as we talked with our consumers, because I feel like there's this element of what we sometimes call as making you eat your broccoli, which my kids actually like broccolini, at least. I don't know if
Yeah.
they make the distinction, but it's kind of like, how can you be effective at helping people actually not just providing the education, but getting them to engage with and learn from the opportunity to understand, financial literacy and products a little bit better?
Yeah, we do. We do a fair amount of financial literacy that our employees, volunteer as the teachers for. There
Mhm.
are several organizations that we partner with to facilitate some of that. And I think we're trying to take the approach of, the thought process that education is really important. Financial education is
Mhm.
important to people, and there's a gap in that education, right? It's certainly not the only factor in improving the inclusivity of lending, but it's one of the factors. And we used to live in a society where a lot of this was taught in school, right? Many years ago, and in high school, you
Mhm.
may have had sort of a personal finance or some sort of home economic class where you learned about balancing your checkbook, way back when, and all of these things. But a lot of that has gone out of our school system,
Yeah.
and I know some school systems in some states like Florida are trying to bring some of that back and make it mandatory. But I do think there's a huge gap and a really huge need, and that's where I've seen a lot of institutions step up to try to fill that gap with financial literacy,
Mm.
to help people really understand. Because if you didn't get it in school, it's very hard. Where would you learn that, right? If your parents maybe weren't the greatest with money, would you have anybody to teach you
Yeah.
if you didn't get it at home or at school?
Yeah, if it's not at school, it becomes kind of inherited in that way where people, parents who are good and understand it well and teach their kids and are conscientious can do that. But for kids that maybe don't have that, or parents without the time and resources to do that, it's harder. Have you found anything that's particularly effective? I mean, this is, maybe I ask as a parent of kids who I'm trying to get to be smarter,
Mhm.
but it's always stunning to me, even just the basics. Like we have consumers call us and ask, the difference between interest rate and an APR, and total lack of clarity and understanding
Yeah.
on how those things are calculated. So, but I'm curious if you've seen programs that are particularly effective or that you think work well versus others, because I think it's such an important topic for the country as a whole, that we have a better educated on, more financially literate population.
Yeah, it is. I think we should actually focus on it for younger kids.
Mm.
We tend to focus, I think, at like a middle school, high school level a lot, just
Hmm.
across the nation. And I think younger kids are kind of where it's at, right? To start, building a program that talks about, wants versus needs, and how to budget money and how to save your money. And, I actually think the earlier you can start, the better. The FDIC actually has a really good program called Money Smart that teaches different age groups about different
Mm.
things that are sort of appropriate for the age group that they're in. And I've always been a big fan of that content, because
Hmm.
I think it really works for a very broad group. But I think this is where other organizations really have an opportunity to step in, whether it's Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts. I
Hmm.
think there are sort of after school activities and groups for kids that could step in here and have a role that could really help in preparing a younger generation for long-term financial health.
Yeah, I love that. I love the younger age. I know Boy Scouts. My son's going through this now, and there's a personal management merit badge, and it's like
Hmm.
interest rates and bonds and
Yeah.
equities, and like it's a, if you knew all this stuff well, you'd have a good base. But that's probably something that's not until middle school, end of middle school, kind of, or even high school, where kids get
And it's
the idea.
probably not a popular badge, right?
It's
Like they
required
probably have,
for, if you want to be an Eagle Scout, you have to get it. So it's not
right.
popular, but it is well taken, because it's required for the Eagle
Yeah.
Scout rank.
Yeah, but like when you're talking about younger groups, I'm sure there are like 50 other badges that the younger kids
Yeah,
would
yeah, yeah.
rather have than like this personal,
Yeah,
finance
the fun
management
ones
badge.
are a little more. I have
Yeah.
started paying my kids interest on their. They have a checking account through one of the services, and I pay them interest, and they love it. And I paid a very high rate of interest because, well, otherwise it doesn't add up very fast. Like one
Right.
percent on $100 a year is like every month they're going, I got 5 cents. Like I don't feel it. So I pay like a percent a month, which starts to add up.
Yeah,
You start to
they're
see it.
doing well then, right?
I know I'm losing money on that. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a
well, but
little
it
expensive.
balances out in other ways.
But I found it to be, I sometimes worry that they've now gone too far on the savings side because they watch the number go up. They're like, oh, I pull my money. They're like, what? You need to learn to actually, you have to both enjoy spending money on the things that matter to you and saving appropriately for the long term. It's
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
balance.
there's a balance to it, and it's a hard one. It's a hard one to figure out sometimes.
Yeah, for us adults too, not always an easy balance.
Hmm.
One last question I wanted to ask you about was you had made this comment when we talked earlier about applying the fair lending thought process to non-lending products. And I thought that was
Hmm.
a fascinating statement. And I'd love for you to explain what you mean by that.
Sure. So one of the things that we're seeing just in the regulatory environment and across the industry is a focus on non-lending products and sort of the fairness there. So
Hmm.
think about something like deposit accounts or overdrafts. With the thought being, are you equally paying items that come in for different groups of people? Are you waiving fees for certain groups of people but not for others?
Mm,
Right. So that's one of the focuses that I have as well is how are we treating people on non-lending products? And a lot of it comes down to things like fees and the structure of our accounts and overdrafts is just a huge focus for the industry right now. So
yeah.
and it's sort of akin to a lending product in a way, right? Because if you paid an item, you may be carrying a negative balance, things like that. But I think it's important to make sure that your products are fair and transparent across the board, and a lot of that is non-lending products, right? So you have your deposit products, and if you're offering some kind of rewards, are you giving people what you say you're going to give them? Are you charging the account the way you say you're going to? So some of this gets very technical, and again into the
Hmm.
data side of things. But I think it's really important to make sure that you can give people what you say you're going to give them and
Hmm.
that people can trust you as an institution, and it's critical to do that kind of analysis and sort of self-analysis to see if you really are doing what you say you're doing.
Yeah, yeah. So just one thing I want to follow up on that, because we often struggle with this, which is the kind of like, are you treating different groups equally? And if not, is there a good reason? To your point earlier, like, is this population really riskier from a credit point of view? And that's why the denial rate or the average interest rate might be higher. And that's something that's a little easier to quantify in some ways because you have real loss data and you can go, well,
Mhm.
yeah, we can see losses, or you could use credit scores. Though I would argue they're a pretty poor proxy to real risk, but they're metrics. In the non-lending products, it can be a little. I would imagine harder to figure out what the data that you use to determine if you've got a reasonable disparity or one that's unfair. Do you have any advice or things you found or ways you think about that question? Because it's this question of like, is it reasonable to have that disparity is an important one, but one that feels like it's quite hard to define in terms of data and metrics, particularly for lending products where there's not a clear like risk
Yeah,
metric that you're kind of targeting.
it is hard, and I would say the only advice I have is to really challenge yourself on what you think is reasonable.
Mm,
Because sometimes I think we're very prone to thinking that, oh, institutions have done it this way for decades, right? So it's obviously normalized. It's not an issue. But I think everybody should challenge themselves to think about if what they're doing is reasonable and if it makes sense for the consumer, if there's an actual business reason for it that you can feel okay about, right? Because
mhm.
it's one thing to try to determine if something's allowable per regulation or something like that. But I also try to think about whether something is right or not right. Would I be upset if someone was treating my mother this way, right? Or my
Yeah.
my teenage child who may not know better. And sometimes it just comes down to really challenging yourself to look at something with sort of eyes wide open and see how you feel about it. It's certainly not an all emotional reaction, but I think a lot of us, if we did that, may be able to think about things differently. And sometimes you have to sort of challenge that long standing thought process of, well,
Mm.
we've always done it this way.
Yeah, it
That
reminds me of
still
what
might
you.
not be the best way, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of, my son recently read the book on Elon Musk, and his kind of always going to, I think he says down to the physics of it, but like down to first
Mhm.
principles, like not the way it's been done or the way we say or the formulas we all use, but like just break it down to the basic principles of what's going on and does it make sense? And I think that's such a important thing, particularly in compliance where it's easy to get caught up in the way we've always applied the reg, the ratio we've always looked at for this analysis. We go, we always look at this and it's always said this and that's fine. So we don't even really think about what the principles underlying that are and do they still apply and does it make sense and is it achieving what we want it to achieve at the end of the day?
Yeah, well, and it's one of the things that I say a lot is that we have to remember that there are people behind all of the numbers we look at, right? It's very
Mm,
easy to sort of try to condense things down to data, and the data is important, don't get me wrong. But I do think it's important to kind of pull yourself back and remember that these are people who have financial goals, things that they're trying to achieve, and they're not just a score or an algorithm, right? There are people behind this that are trying to do something, whether that's buy a home, buy a car, manage their account, whatever the case may be. There are people behind all of these numbers.
yeah. Do you have any particular ways that you try and help that stay top of mind for your team? I keep saying one last question, then I keep going with other ones that I want to ask. But it's such a great point about remembering the people behind the numbers or the data or the process or whatever. But it can be like, I'm curious how you put that in practice and help your team actually, you know, keep those people in mind.
I do. I go back a lot to like the grandmother or the child rule. Like
Mm,
if your grandmother was getting this product, would you feel okay about it? If your kid had signed up for this product, would you feel okay about it? And that's I try really hard to personalize it based on your family, your friends, whatever the case may be. If
hmm
this was not just sort of an unknown person or sort of a stream of numbers in your data set, how would you feel about that? And it takes real effort, but I try to remind people of that as frequently as I can.
Yeah, it's a great thing to keep in mind. And what's that? Yeah, I think it's great. It's a great reminder of what's really important and why the industry matters. And I will say, it's, as a guy who came from tech, and I've said this many times, but into finance, the focus of most bankers on the consumer and what's good for the consumer is not, I think, the popular perception of the industry, but is much more real, at least in the kind of retail banking side, than I think most
Mhm.
people appreciate. It's one of the things I've discovered and really enjoyed about the industry is people really are here trying to help somebody get a home or buy a car or save for retirement or
Yeah,
put a kid through college, whatever it might be.
absolutely. I think, every institution that I've worked for or worked with was trying to do the right thing. Right?
Yep.
There may be challenges to doing that, whether it's data, whether it's the regulatory environment. But I feel fortunate to say that I have not worked with an institution that I did not feel like was trying their best to serve their
At the end of the
communities.
day, was trying to do the right thing for their consumers.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this really is the last because I got three questions I always ask everybody at the
All
end.
right.
So now I won't go off topic. Well, I can't
Okay.
promise that. But so I'm gonna throw them out kind of rapid fire. So now, so number one, what's the best piece of career advice you've ever gotten?
Probably that communication is an art form and a skill set unto itself, right? Whatever you're trying to say, it has to be said to the right person at the right time, and have the right content, right? Because no matter how you feel you're communicating, if the message isn't received, it has not been communicated appropriately. No matter how effective you think what you said was, if the recipient didn't get the message, then you've kind of failed at that. So anything I've received in terms of communication has been particularly valuable.
Such a great point. Doesn't matter what you said; it matters what they heard at the end of the day.
Pretty much,
Um,
yeah.
I mean, that's the reality of trying to convince somebody of something or convey information. All right, that's good career advice. I like that. What's the best piece of advice you've gotten about the consumer banking or lending space?
Probably, like I said, that there are people, behind all of these numbers. That was something that a mentor of mine used to push all the time, that we had
Mm,
to step back and think about, individuals. And so if somebody was receiving this ad, how were they going to receive it? Back to the communication piece, right? Were they going to read it the way that we intended it? Were they going to get the message that we intended? So yeah, all about really kind of trying to step back and think about individual recipients and what they were thinking about and what their needs might be, and trying to really kind of zoom in and zoom out when you need to, in terms of the people that are behind your data.
it's a great description. Zoom in and zoom out, and both are important. Got to have
Mhm.
both tools in the toolbox.
Yeah.
All right, and last question for real. What is one bold prediction for the future? This is my hold your
Yeah.
feet to the fire in a year or two.
I don't think it's necessarily bold, but I think we are going to see more disruption, more consumer options, and more consumer choice in the space. Whether
Mm,
that's via technology, additional product offerings, right? We've seen sort of an explosion of technology in
yeah.
the financial space, but sometimes technology is not enough, right? It's got to be paired with the right product offering. And I think we're
Sure.
going to see more partnership between institutions and maybe fintechs or other tech firms, and people, I think, figuring out the balance of the technology plus the product offerings, and what people actually
Mm.
need.
I love that prediction because I do feel like the first wave of fintech was, I often talk about digitization is the wrong goal. It was kind of like, let's take the old thing and make it available on the phone. And
Hmm.
I think the really interesting question is, what's the new thing we could have made
Right.
given the phone that is better for the consumer and the institution? I think we're just starting to get to the point where we're really seeing that
Yeah.
question being tackled, which is an exciting time.
Yeah. No, I think if we could get that balance right, we would see kind of even less of the unbanked and underbanked space, right? We would see a real explosion, I think, of servicing maybe some underserved customers. I think that would be great.
I love it. Well, that seems like a great place to draw to a close. Britt, thanks for taking the time today and talk with me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. I was so happy to be here.